He read the contract once. Then he signed it without changing a single word. The man sitting across from him, Joe Glazer, former manager of the Sunset Cafe, a man with documented connections to Al Capone's Chicago operation, didn't say anything when Louis Armstrong set down the pen. He just nodded. The people who saw that contract later, in the years after both men were gone, said it was one of the most one-sided arrangements in the history of American entertainment. Glazer got 50% of everything. He controlled all bookings, all decisions, all money. Armstrong got the other half and the right to play trumpet. Louis Armstrong had read the terms. He knew exactly what he was signing, and he signed it anyway. The question that has followed that moment for nearly 90 years is not whether the deal was fair. It clearly wasn't. The question is what Louis Armstrong was escaping from, and whether this contract was the only door out. To understand 1935, you have to go back to what preceded it. Louis Armstrong had spent the early 1930s in a kind of controlled chaos. His playing was at the highest level it had ever been. His fame was enormous. He had performed across Europe. He was known on 3 continents. His recordings sold reliably, and his live performances sold out. By any measure, he should have been secure. He was not secure. Not even close. The entertainment business of the 1932nd, particularly for black performers, was not a business in any clean sense of the word. It was a network of interests that overlapped with organized crime in ways that were not always visible from the outside, but were entirely visible if you were the performer trying to navigate it. Booking agents demanded percentages that left little. Venue operators skimmed. Managers disappeared with money. And in certain cities, Chicago foremost among them, the people who controlled which performers worked where and when were not businessmen in any conventional sense. Armstrong had been through several management situations by 1935, none of them clean. His manager, Johnny Collins, had a drinking problem, a violent temper, and a habit of collecting Armstrong's fees and accounting for them in ways that Louis could never quite reconcile with what he actually saw. Collins had made promises to club owners and booking agents using Armstrong's name, and when those promises weren't kept, the consequences fell on Armstrong. There were threats, there were confrontations. There was a period in 1931 when Armstrong essentially had to leave Chicago, not because he wanted to, but because remaining had become genuinely dangerous. The people to whom Collins had made bad promises were not the kind of people who accepted apologies. He went to California. He went to England. He kept moving, which is the oldest survival strategy there is. But moving is not the same as solving. The problems followed at a distance, and Louis Armstrong, playing to thousands of people every night, was somehow unable to find solid footing in the business that surrounded the music he made. Joe Glazer was not a good man in the conventional sense. He had managed the Sunset Cafe in Chicago during the years when Al Capone's organization had interests in Chicago nightlife. He was hard, transactional, and operated according to rules that were more pragmatic than ethical. He was also, by 1935, looking for a new opportunity. And he had watched Louis Armstrong for years, watched the talent, watched the mismanagement, watched a man of extraordinary gifts being badly served by everyone around him. Glazer made Armstrong an offer. He would handle everything, every booking, every negotiation, every contract, every problem. Armstrong would play. Glazer would manage. The split was 50-50, A number that sounds like equality until you understand what Glazer was taking 50% of and what his costs were in generating it. Armstrong's friends advised him against it. Some of them used language considerably stronger than advice. The deal looked, from the outside, like exchanging one exploitative situation for another. Glazer's reputation preceded him. Nobody looked at Joe Glazer and saw a protector. Armstrong sighed anyway. What he understood, and what took decades to become fully visible, was that Glazer offered something none of the previous arrangements had: genuine protection. Not from bad contracts, the contract itself was bad, but from the specific dangers that had been accumulating around Armstrong's life. Glazer's connections to organized crime were not a liability in this context. They were the point. He could make phone calls that made problems disappear. He could speak to the people who controlled the venues Armstrong needed to play in language those people understood and respected. He could clear the path in ways that a conventional manager simply could not. Louis Armstrong, born in the battlefield neighborhood of New Orleans, who had navigated poverty and Jim Crow and the criminal element of multiple American cities before he turned 30, was not naive about what he was signing. He was buying something specific. He was buying the ability to spend the rest of his career doing what he did, instead of managing the consequences of what everyone else around him did. The partnership lasted 34 years. Glazer ran the business with absolute authority. Armstrong played. The arrangement worked, commercially, artistically, and in terms of the basic fact of Armstrong's survival in an industry that had consumed many of his peers. It was not without cost. There were years when Armstrong suspected, correctly, that the accounting he received did not reflect the full picture of what he had earned. He raised questions occasionally and then let them go, because the alternative, investigating, confronting, potentially ending the arrangement, was worse than the uncertainty. He had seen what happened when management arrangements fell apart. He had lived through it. Late in his life, in conversations with people he trusted, Armstrong talked about Glazer in ways that were complicated and consistent at the same time. He acknowledged that Glazer had made him rich by the standards of any previous point in his life. He acknowledged that Glazer had handled things that would otherwise have been unmanageable. And he acknowledged, in quieter moments, that he had never fully known what he was worth. "Joe always took care of everything," he said once, in a way that carried both gratitude and something that was not quite its opposite. Joe Glazer had a stroke in May 1969 and fell into a coma. Louis Armstrong went to the hospital and sat with him. Glazer never regained consciousness. Armstrong, by the account of everyone present, was devastated. He had not always known exactly what Glazer had taken from him, but he knew what Glazer had given him, and he knew that whatever the accounting showed, the man lying in that hospital bed had, in his own particular way, made Louis Armstrong's career possible. He sat by the bed for a long time. He didn't say much. When he left, someone asked him how he was. He said, "I lost my left arm." Armstrong died 2 years later. His estate, when it was eventually sorted through, revealed financial arrangements that had been more complicated than Armstrong had known. There were accounts, percentages, structures that had worked heavily in Glazer's favor over 3 decades. Whether Armstrong would have been better served by a different arrangement is a question that cannot be answered, because the counterfactual requires imagining a Louis Armstrong who survived the early 1930 seconds intact, who found management that was honest and capable, who navigated the particular dangers of that specific world without the particular protection that Joe Glazer offered. That Louis Armstrong may not have existed. The one who did, who played Newport in 1956, who knocked the Beatles off the charts in 1964, who recorded What a Wonderful World in a single take, signed a contract in 1935 that he read carefully, understood clearly, and chose with open eyes. Some choices look like surrender from the outside. From the inside, they look like the only door that opens onto tomorrow. Louis Armstrong walked through it, and he played for 36 more years.